Hello everyone, welcome to another session of True ML video talks. And today, and as you know, I'm Nikunj Bajaj, co-founder and CEO at TrueFoundry. And today we have a very special guest and a close friend, Anant Narayanan, with whom I got a chance to work with while I was at Meta. I'll give a brief introduction about Anant. Anant is an engineering leader, currently an engineering director at Meta, working on some of the smart glasses product experiences. He started as an open source contributor and has held key roles at both startups and tech giants. At Mozilla, he has helped define and implement WebRTC among other browser technologies, and he was also an early Firebase engineer focusing on developer tools and support. He later joined Oslo as their first engineer, helping build a personalized, intelligent personal assistant as well. And I would Anand, I would invite you to add any further details that you would love to, that you would like to add for our audience in terms of your intro as well.
Well, thank you, Nico. It's great to see you after a while, and thanks for inviting me up to come and talk. Very excited. But yeah, no, you covered it pretty well. So I love open source. That's sort of my roots and background. And recently, I've been sort of starting to tinker a lot with the Gen AI stuff, as I think many folks in the industry have, more in sort of a personal capacity. So I'm very excited to dig into sort of my learnings. But also just my opinions are my own, not my employers. So these are all just my kind of personal thoughts, but I'm excited to talk about Gen
Yeah,
AI.
for sure. Like the literally the way we got to this is I follow Anant, like read his blogs and stuff, and I noticed that Anant is really enjoying playing around with Gen AI and LLMs. So I thought we would love to hear his point of view on what's happening in the ecosystem. So again, disclaimer that this is completely with Anant and not. All right. So Anant, should we jump into it?
Yeah,
Cool.
let's do it.
So the first thing I noticed one of your posts where you indicated like a nice shiny looking GPU that you bought. Curious which GPU was it?
Yeah, I ended up getting the RTX 4090, so pretty much the cutting edge state of the art that you can get as a consumer. I know there's a lot of cool stuff happening with NVIDIA launching H100 and things like that that are a little bit more focused on the cloud and the enterprise. But yeah, ended up getting the 4090.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice. I'm very curious, Anant. Why did you decide to buy one instead of using the ones that you get with some cloud providers or and I have a couple of other follow up questions on that as well.
Yeah, let's get into it. I mean, it was kind of a impulse purchase, but I think the root of it was actually, if you'd seen like one of my tweets, like one week I was getting pretty frustrated because I wasn't able to get good GPUs in the cloud at all. And I tried all of them, right? I have a long-standing personal account with AWS that I host all of my personal services on, and they made me jump through so many hoops to try to get like a A100. It's like file this form and that form, and then, oh, are you a company? Are you an individual? And I kind of got similar pushback from Lambda Labs, Google Cloud Compute. I ended up trying Vultr for a little while, and everybody is sort of, there's always this manual process you kind of have to go through to get actually the really good GPUs, the A100s, 40 gigs, 80 gigs, what have you. And I mean, actually today I jumped through a bunch of hoops and I now have access to a couple of cloud like instances, but at the time it was very difficult to get. And so I was like, oh man, it just dawned on me that the demand for this stuff is so high. And obviously a lot of the cloud providers are prioritizing large customer accounts. Like a couple of questions I would get from the cloud providers, like, oh, what's your anticipated spend over the next year for the GPU? And like trying to turn me into like an enterprise customer. I was like, hey man, I'm just like a dude in the garage. I just want to run some experiments. Like, can I just get like a couple hours of GPU time? And that didn't quite, align with how these cloud providers really think about it. I think so for a hobbyist, I think it's been quite challenging to get access to really some of the state of the art GPU. So that led to like, just like I said, impulse purchase where I'm like, oh, maybe I'm better off just going and getting a good GPU, and it's like the supply has gotten better with 4090, I think, compared to like 6 months ago where it was like scalpers on eBay or whatever. It's gotten a lot better. So it was just quick trip down to computer store and just kind of grab it and
Nice,
go.
nice.
Yeah.
I personally face this problem, as I'm sure that many others listening to this recording would also have faced. It's just like too many meetings with AWS to kind of get hold of these GPUs. So
Exactly. Yes, I completely agree. And as a hobbyist, if I were running a company, I might have had a different approach. But as a hobbyist, really, all I needed was just a few hours. So it's like, okay, let me just go buy a GPU because it's so frustrating to get to cloud. That being said, we'll see. I mean, now that the H100s are launched, I think the demand is going to shift to the
Right.
hot new, and maybe they'll leave some of the A100s for us little guys to go play with. So
Nice, nice.
we'll see. Yeah.
Now, one thing is like, how was it to set it up yourself? Like, like buying a GPU and set things up. Like one thing that you do get with cloud providers is like the ecosystem that you kind of get around the GPUs, right? So, how was your experience setting it
Yeah.
up yourself?
Yeah, this is something that for me is just a personal experience. Look, I'm not a traditional ML guy, right? That's not been the history of my career, which you covered a little bit in the background, but I've mostly come from a system slash product background. So a lot of this ML stuff is like pretty new to me and I'm learning as I go. And so from a language choice perspective, I've always been like a very Go person. Like I use Go for all my side projects and everything. And so one of the first things that I ran into was, whether we like it or not, Python is the lingua franca for AI. And I was like, okay, whatever project I'm doing, it has to be in Python because that's where everyone is and that's where all the libraries are and everything like that. But oh man, I wasted the first day just in Python dependency hell. I was just like, oh cool, let me, pip install whatever. It's like, oh, good luck, right? I mean, there's a reason where the first line in every GitHub project is like, you start with your virtual environment or your Anaconda, whatever. And I just ignored it. I was like, oh, why do I need a virtual environment? Why do I need a separate Python environment for every project? That just seems so silly. And I was like, oh yeah, just listen to the README, right? I mean, there's a reason why they ask you to do that. It's just, pip
Never want to deal with that.
is quite frustrating to work with. I mean, some of these errors I just can't even understand. It's like, why can't I have two versions of the same thing? Which a lot of the other languages have really figured out, like Rust, Cargo, and Go, and all these stuff is like pretty solved problem. But for whatever reason, Python's like caught in this like old school dependency management stuff. I would say that was pretty much the biggest challenge I had is just setting up my environment and getting it up and running. And to your point, I think a lot of the cloud providers have this figured out, right? Like I mentioned, I eventually got access to some
Yeah.
of the cloud GPUs, and you just got an image, and it's
Right.
got everything set up for you already with all the right Python and everything. I wasted about 4 hours getting it to work with my CUDA whatever, and I had a fairly like interesting setup where I have like this Windows machine. Because I set it up as my like gaming
Hmm.
GPU, right? And then I run this like WSL environment on Windows, which added some more layers of complexity to like make sure that the Python applications actually have access to the native NVIDIA drivers for CUDA and stuff like that. But looking back, I think yeah, it was basically a day and a half of fighting with Python dependencies, CUDA setup, all this stuff. But I think I eventually got to a place where I don't mess with it. I use PyEnv now to manage my stuff. I think I've written on my blog about how I go about doing that, and that I'm pretty happy with that setup.
Nice.
Um, but yeah, I would say that was probably the most like difficult part of getting it all up
All
and
right,
running.
all right. That's good to know. And by any chance, on that note, have you tried poetry as well?
I have not read poetry.
So,
What is
like,
poetry?
I think poetry is like the new way of doing some package management with Python, and like a lot of people like it over
Oh,
using
I
it.
should check it out. There's a bunch of folks trying it out. There was one tool I tried called Cog, which I think the
Mhm.
folks at Replicate built, which is just like a Docker container that has everything built in, and that was useful. But it's not as useful to run stuff locally. It's pretty useful if you're gonna like packet something up to like send to the cloud or whatever. But yeah, there's a bunch of tools there. I'll check Poetry
Awesome.
out. Thanks for
Yeah.
the recommendation.
So now like now that you have like your GPU setup and your dependencies all figured out, like what are some of the cool experiments that you have been running?
Yeah, the main reason I actually bought the GPU is actually just to run fine tuning on stable diffusion. So I'd read about this very cool technique, Dream Boost, which I think actually powers the commercial app Lensa, where you can sort of take photos of yourself and create all these
Hmm.
custom avatars, which I had tried out way back in the day. Like whenever Lensa had launched, way back in the day, it's probably 6 months ago. And I was like, oh man, the more I read, there was a lot of evidence to suggest they were using this kind of Dream Boost method to fine tune stable diffusion, the open source image generation model or diffusion model, and customize it for your face. And that's such a cool application. I was like, oh, I wonder if I could do that for myself and try it out. Um, and that's kind of what I spent my time on. And then eventually I stumbled upon LoRa, which is a little bit more of a cutting edge technique compared to Dream Booth, where Dream Booth is like a full model tune, right? So basically, the output of Dream Booth is another stable diffusion model, which is like 5-6 gigabytes in size, but it now has an understanding of your
Right.
subject, like whatever you chose to train it with. And that obviously has some downsides because the quality is pretty good, but now you have this huge 5 gigabyte model checkpoint, and you can't apply multiple at the same time. So multiple faces, multiple styles, this and that. So this LoRa technique was pretty interesting, and so I then pivoted to try running a bunch of like LoRa fine tuning and things like that. And we can talk about LoRa later, but yeah, just much more lighter weight to input. And so yeah, probably the first couple of weeks of getting the GPU was spent mostly in like an image generation
Nice.
space, just customizing. Yeah, avatar styles. There's lots of cool things you can do with it. Recently, I've been switching over more to classic like LLM type stuff, which it's come in super handy. Like I had this project to do like a search over Hacker News, and I was like, oh, okay, I can call OpenAI and pay a couple cents for a few hundred embeddings, but I was like, hey, I've got this really nice GPU here. It's like, let me just run embeddings locally, like create the embeddings locally. So um, created a batch job, ran overnight. 4090 is really good. Like it's actually it's about as good as A100
Wow.
as far as
Wow.
performance is concerned. Like you can just churn through this data. So I embedded all of Hacker News in like overnight, basically. I just got a job running, and so yeah, having a GPU locally on my computer was pretty helpful for that.
Nice. I would
Uh,
love
so
to
that's a
I
couple of
would love to
examples.
dive deeper into some of these use cases. Actually, I'm sure like folks are going to learn a lot,
Yeah,
lot, a
let's do
lot
it.
with these. Yeah. But I think before I get into some of these like very specific use cases, there's a few questions that we keep getting from the community, and would love to hear your point of view on this, Anant. So one of the things that is like top of mind for a lot of folks is like the word around data security and like the data moat, the like when you're using OpenAI, right? Now, to
Yeah.
be honest, some folks are also mentioning that, like, like with OpenAI exposing this flag that, hey, we are not going to use your data to fine tune our models or like retrain our models and stuff like that. And maybe Azure OpenAI coming in like for the rescue, etc. Some people are becoming more and more okay with it. But whereas others are still doubtful about the competitive advantage, right, that they might have. So, would love to hear your take on like on this entire issue.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think there's a few different ways to sort of look at it. So I can just talk through my thoughts here. The first one is I think what OpenAI is doing is actually quite reasonable from my perspective, at least for a consumer, because ChatGPT is a free product that anyone can go use, and I think in exchange you are providing your data to help make their models better. And I think it's a fair trade, right? You're getting a lot of value out of this product. You're not paying for it. What does OpenAI get out of this? Because it does cost them actually quite significant amounts of money to run the service. And so the trade-off there is okay. They're going to use your conversations to make the model better, and I think that's a good value exchange in my opinion. Then you've got the people that pay for it, so ChatGPT Plus subscribers, where you're paying for it. I think you can opt out, but then you lose conversation history, which also I think is a fair trade-off. Primarily because I think $20 a month is actually quite cheap for the amount of value I get. I immediately exhaust my 25 messages every 3 hours. So I'm using the heck out of ChatGPT, right? And it's like, I feel like I'm getting a bargain for $20 a month, relative to, I would pay more to have a thing like this. And so I can see that trade off of like, yeah, you can use my data to help to make the model better. You're subsidizing the cost in some way. And of course, I can turn it off if I want, but then I lose conversation history. So I think these are pretty, I think, reasonable decisions that OpenAI is making. Then you've got the real enterprise folks, right? Where it's like, okay, actually, we're not kidding around anymore. Now I want to use this for an actual use case in my company. I don't want my data anywhere leaving, my premises. And that, yeah, I think that they're jumping on this, right? Like, I think OpenAI already announced like a plan for enterprises that they're planning to do, aside from even their partners with Microsoft, where you can run things in Azure in a secure enclave or what have you. Uh, but it's not just OpenAI's game to take. I think Anthropic recently announced a partnership with AWS Bedrock, where now you can run the cloud model, uh, cloud, I guess, however they call it, inside this secure enclave that AWS will provide. That's a well-known quantity for a lot of enterprises because they've used this kind of stuff from
Right.
AWS before. There's a fair guarantee there of like data would not leave this cluster of machines, right? And so the model moves to you, you keep the data there, and Anthropic is like, look, we'll just charge you money for this, and we're not interested in your data to make the model better. So I think this stuff will just work out. And I think I see reasonable moves from companies like OpenAI, Azure, and Anthropic here. And of course, the really, really big players like Google and stuff probably just run everything in house anyway, so it doesn't apply
Right.
to them. Um, One thing I will say about the whole privacy thing is that just always be aware of like stated preference versus observed behavior. I think there's definitely a lot of tendency in the tech press and early adopters crowd to like pay so much attention to this and like, oh, privacy, yeah, oh, my data, this and that. But for the average consumer, it's like, what's the value that you're providing to their in their life, right? Like, and I consider myself a tech person. I care a lot about privacy, having worked at Mozilla and all these places. But at the end of the day, if you're providing value and you're a reputed company, I mean, obviously nobody wants data, anywhere, but as long as the company is reputable, like people trust Amazon, right? People trust, I don't know, OpenAI, they still have to like prove their reputation, but in general, I think customers will happily trade off some of their privacy for value in exchange, right? And what does trade off privacy really even mean? It's not like your name and the thing that you said is out there for someone to read. It's really like there's so many steps of like anonymization, filtering, and it gets slurped into the model in aggregate where it makes it very hard to extract the original pieces of data anyway. And so I think I tend to take a lot more balanced perspective here that this stuff will just work itself out in the
Yeah.
long term.
No, I
Yeah.
think that makes a ton of sense. I think for individuals, what you mentioned would definitely, like, actually makes a ton of sense. And in fact, people have been doing this for ages now with like Google, Amazon, Facebook, right? So I don't think
Exactly. Yes.
for an average
Yeah.
consumer that's much different. Imagine whatever, like, all the chat apps, right? Messenger or whatever, like people have the data. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the main thing is around the enterprises. So people are trying to build on top of
Yes.
OpenAI and stuff. And I guess like the things
Yeah.
that you talked about, like, Bedrock, and also some partnerships with Azure probably would solve for these problems in the long term.
It's clear that it's a priority for them because that's also where the money is. So I'm not surprised that my prediction is that most of the large LLM providers will have an option to ship their model to you and you run it in whatever environment you want. Um, and yeah, like Anthropic's already done that with Bedrock. OpenAI is going to do it, and that should be a good, I think, compromise
Makes sense.
for the
Makes sense.
enterprises.
Makes a
Yeah.
ton of sense. And so this is the privacy and security angle, right? The data security angle. But there is also this another debate that happens in the ecosystem around just long-term sustainability of these very large generalized models versus like
Yeah.
smaller, fine-tuned models for your own like data set or specific use case and stuff like that, right? Um,
Yeah.
and of course, like, there's been a lot of I think this topic has got a lot more momentum lately since like that leaked, I don't know what that means,
The memo
the,
yeah,
the
from
memo
Google.
from
Yeah.
Google,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah. Yeah, that's been crazy. I mean, look, given my open source roots, I'm just insanely excited about what's going on right now. Few thoughts. I think, yeah, the memo, I haven't ever directly worked at Google, but I know a lot of people that work there, close friends. And yeah, I mean, this is just a message from someone who posted on the internal mailing list, right? I don't think it's reflective of the actual position of Google. I very much agree with, and I also think it was sensationalized a bit with the headline because the headline actually said some things that the memo actually didn't say, which is we have no moat, right? I mean, it's sort of a little bit of an exaggeration, but I think um, I agree with the sentiment behind it, which is that look, I think the sentiment behind the memo is really that LLMs are likely to get commoditized. I actually very much agree with that. It used to be the case that 6 months ago, a year ago, there was this argument that hey, it's going to be very challenging for startups or hobbyist hackers or what have you to replicate a large language model. Um, and it's because it costs so much. Like you have to spend so much money in web crawling, your data acquisition, but also the actual training of the model is very expensive. It's a multi-month process with hundreds of GPUs, thousands of GPUs, and it's just this capital-intensive investment that wasn't reached with anyone. But I do think that the way things have shaken out has now just, I think, removed that as an objection. I think these runway ML stability AI guys really did the biggest contribution they had was really stable diffusion, right? They kicked this whole movement off where it's like, you know what, let's just put the model weights on GitHub and see what happens, right? It's like, so they did that for the diffusion model, and very glad to see that's starting to happen in the language space as well. Um, Inadvertently by Llama, but Llama is not actually open source, just to be super clear. I mean, it's like this leaked stuff that you have to go to BitTorrent and download whatever. Blah. It's not actually open source. Like you can't actually do anything real with it, like commercial. But there are real like open source licensed LLMs, right? You've got the stuff from the Eleuther AI guys. There's a stable LM that got launched recently. So I think now that it's out there, it's out there. There's no putting the cat back in the bag, and I think that's great. I think it's now putting all this technology in the hands of just open source hobbyists and hackers, which is in general a good thing. A little bit of a philosophical point about why I think that, like, it's much better to develop the stuff in the open than it is in the closed. I think there's, let's not put this in the hands of a few powerful people and see what they do with it. Not to mention, on a global scale, there's nation states that are really going to go after this stuff. And so I think in net, it's probably better to work on the stuff in the open and just talk about it and have these tools in the hands of people that can do stuff with it. I think in general, more eyes on this, right, is generally going to be a better thing. So yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. I think this is really great. I agree with the sentiment of the memo, which is that the stuff, because it's out there now, it's commoditized. It will be. I mean, commoditized is a strong word in the sense that, look, cloud providers are also quote unquote commoditized, right? There's nothing really that you get from AWS that you can't also get from Azure or Google Cloud Compute. And yet these are very successful, valuable businesses. So let's separate those two things. I think you'll still have a set of 4 or 5 large language model providers, knowledge providers, foundational model providers, whatever name you want to give them. And they will be great businesses, and they'll be great platforms on which you can build stuff. But from a consumer standpoint or a developer standpoint, you're actually not locked in to one or the other, because you can always like shift your stuff to another stuff. You said something else interesting. We can spend some time on that. Is like, what's the interplay between these large kind of language models and the smaller one? I don't have a dogmatic view on this. I think they both need to exist. I predict that you will have computation happening at multiple layers. Like you will do simple stuff on the phone when you can, and when you can't, you will ship data to the server to run the more heavyweight stuff. I think there's a temptation to want to be on one side of the pendulum or the other. I think the practicality, I don't see that playing out. I think there's going to be some inference that happens on the edge, and there's going to be some inference that happens in the cloud. And I'm okay with that. Like I'm not dogmatic about, oh, it must happen all on device or it must happen all on the server. I think the use case really dictates what you want, right? And I'm very happy with a hybrid world here where we're going to have both, and it's on a case by case basis about where it goes.
Understood. And I guess one more thing here, like in terms of the actual performance, right? So of course, like on a generic, like write this blog for me or write this poem for me type of thing, we expect that like these very large language models will continue to outperform, like these smaller versions, right? um, but to be
Yeah.
completely honest, like I played around with a lot of these models, and even for smaller data sets, even despite like a lot of fine tuning, um, these small models today are not able to catch up with the kind of performance that, yeah,
They don't
they
work
just
as
don't work
well.
as
Yeah.
well, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
I so much agree with that. Like I agree. Like our most recent project, even on the Hacker News stuff, I tried a bunch of stuff, but it's so difficult to beat GPT 3.5, leave alone GPT 4. Like, um, and it's kind of funny because I see some tall claims. Oh, we are at 75%, 80% of GPT performance. I'm like, no, you're not. Like, not when I use it. Like, I don't, you know what I mean? Maybe I'm doing something wrong. Like, maybe I'm not using it the way that it's intended. But there's so much to dig into. Like, okay, what test set did you actually use to like evaluate and claim that you're like at 80% performance of GPT 3.5? It really resonates with me what you're saying. But let's also understand that it's really more about where the puck is going to be than where it's now. I think the reason people are excited about it is not the fact that oh, the absolute quality here is already there, because it's not. I don't think both you and I have not experienced it. But it's really about the fact that it's even possible, right? And so it's like stock prices, right? Like, is Tesla actually worth what they're worth today? No. I think the thing is, oh, if they capture the entire electric car market, then what their valuation is going to be. It's sort of a more futuristic looking view. It's the same thing that's happening. It's like, oh, open source LLMs will one day be actually quite powerful, and I buy into that, because a lot of this stuff takes time. And so it's really more of a speculative thing than it is about the absolute state of the quality today.
Makes
But yes, again, I think there's four axes here, right? You've got cloud and local, and then you've got open and proprietary. And I think this four square is going to be a very interesting.
nice.
There's going to be dots appearing in various quadrants, and we'll see how it
Makes
plays
sense.
out.
Makes
Yeah.
sense. Awesome. So Anand, let's jump into some of the experiments that you have been running. So I know that you mentioned about training a bunch of embeddings on top of Hacker News data. Would love to hear, like, what did you like eventually build out? What were some of the challenges that you faced when you were trying to run those embedding models? Which actually models did you end up running, for that matter? Like, would love to hear some thoughts there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great question. Um, the biggest challenge, I think, this is something I really want to share with everyone, and I put a point in this in my blog post describing my experience with building this kind of Hacker News search as a ChatGPT plugin, is just cutting through a lot of the marketing that's going on in AI right now. I think um, because the AI space is so hot, right, and there's so many not just non-ML folks like myself, but also technical folks, right? Because now it's become so easy to build stuff on top, even if you don't have a super strong technical knowledge. Like we have examples of just great product managers building products just using ChatGPT with an idea, and that's all they have. That's amazing because you have this huge influx of folks. But in the rush to either get on the hype and this and that, it's like you're being pushed towards adopting solutions that are like maybe not the right fit for what you're doing or not the right scale. Even just take the example of embeddings, right? Actually, not everybody needs embeddings as a service, right? And as part of what I'm trying to prove with this Hacker News thing is like, hey, your data isn't your big data isn't big, right? Like actually look at how big your data actually is and sort of pick a solution that's proportional to what you need. I think there's a temptation to hyperscale everything from day one and go to this massively distributed cloud embedding document store and X, Y, and Z. And there's a place for that for sure. There's clearly demand there for like actually large customers and big enterprises and things like that. But I think the first challenge was just cutting through that and seeing like getting to the bottom of like what actually is happening on the low level. It's like, oh, I was actually, let me tell you this. I'm not an ML guy. I've been learning all this stuff in the last 6 months. And so, what is even an embedding? And I was like, there's a bunch of stuff I read. It's not really giving me the answer. And then, boom, I had this lightning bulb moment where it's like, oh, embedding is just 768 floats.
Yeah.
That's all it is. It's 768 floating point numbers, and each of them is 4 bytes. That's 3 kilobytes of data. Oh, cool. I'll just stick that in SQLite. Sounds great. you know, I don't need I don't need anything. It's just, I've got a function that takes a piece of text, gives me 768 floating point numbers, and I just store the floating point numbers in SQLite. And that's the solution that I ended up going, really keeping it super simple. But getting to that core of the knowledge was actually surprisingly hard because I had to cut through a lot of the marketing around it, right? I eventually got to it, and turns out actually this technology isn't even new. Like it's been
Right.
around for many years, and I went and looked at the face repo and GitHub's like, oh, it's been around for a long time, and people have been working on it for a long time. And so, but because of this recent
Yeah.
hype around AI, it's got this like resurgence. Now everyone's talking about embeddings, even though it's been around for a while. Uh, and yeah, that was fun. And then I think just figuring out like, hey, I don't need to pay a cloud provider money to generate embeddings. There's tons of great open source embedding libraries that you can just download and run. I ended up using the instructor large
Mm.
model, and the way that I got to it was there's a really nice benchmarking. I think it's called MTEB, the Massive Text Embedding Benchmark on Hugging Face. That's a pretty good benchmark on a number of text tasks like information retrieval, classification, clustering, things like that. And they have this nice benchmark that says what the performance of various embeddings are. A lot of great ones out there, right? There's a native one in sentence transformers, but then there was the instructor large that I ended up using. But there's new ones popping up every day. There's obviously the old ones that already existed, the T5 Excel model, what have you. Ones that run on GPU, ones that run on CPU. How many dimensions do you want? Do you want 512, 768, 1024? The OpenAI one is 1536. And all these trade-offs. And I actually ended up looking at things like LangChain to just quickly prototype and see, oh, like, let's just try it out and see which embedding, you have different metrics you want to measure, right? Like how quick it is to generate the embedding. Like initially I used Instructor XL because it just performs slightly better, but it takes 4 times longer to generate the embedding compared to instructor large. I'm like, oh yeah, I don't care about the 2 points of precision. Let me just go for the faster instructor large model. So speed, quality, all this stuff based on your use case. Like for me, it was really all about how good am I at information retrieval over this particular Hacker News forum discussion corpus, if you will. So definitely a lot of experimentation and playing with it. But really, I would just encourage everyone to get as close to the first principles as they're comfortable, just so they really understand what they're doing and not get swept up in a lot of the craze and immediately go to like 10 servers in the cloud with 100 million embeddings and X, Y, and Z. And it's like, maybe you don't really need it for the
Makes
project that you're
sense.
working on,
Makes
right?
sense.
It's like,
So actually, this is a very interesting point that you mentioned about the instructor Excel versus large model, right? So you mentioned that it took you whatever like an overnight of training these embeddings,
of
generating the
generating
embeddings.
them.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
did you actually end up running both Excel and L models, or did you decide it based on the benchmarks that you saw?
No, I did benchmarks plus a little bit of prototyping. So I picked the model before I ran it because obviously I didn't want to run the big bad job before I've committed to a solution. Um, although for me it was pretty low stakes. Even if I made it fine, I'll just do another one. That's the advantage of having a GPU locally, where it's like I'm not like renting something in the cloud and I have to like keep an eye on my costs or something. I have seen some projects that my friends did where it's like, oh, they got hit with a big cloud bill without even
Right. Yeah,
realizing
yeah,
they just had this job running overnight or whatever. But yeah, I picked instructor large first based on just some quick prototyping, LangChain and stuff, and then once I picked the model, I run this
yeah. I
big
see.
bad job and just ran that overnight to generate 35 million articles. Took overnight, yeah, it took about 18 to
Okay.
24 hours to run, and that's a one-time thing. And then catching up is it just happens on the fly. Like as new content appears on Hacker News, we
Yeah.
use Firebase, the API, and it's all in real time. And embedding that is cheap, right? It's basically like 250 milliseconds to generate embedding. So if you're doing it as a trickle, as the updates go through the day, it's real. You can just do it as the content is appearing. It was just this initial like catch up to the first 35 million articles that had to be like a
That
bad
makes sense.
job.
That makes a ton of sense. All right. Now there is one more question because we talked about plugins, right? OpenAI plugins, and this, by the way, question might even be a bit naive because I have personally not played around with this. But like, I understand OpenAI itself does a great job at figuring out like when to trigger a certain plugin because of how complex the model is. But there's also like, and even in LangChain, right? There is this concept of agents that you can invoke, and potentially you
Yeah,
can do
yeah,
that with open source models as well. So my
that's right.
question is, are open source models just as good in trying to figure out when to invoke an agent versus when to kind of answer by themselves? Or is it similar to like, the tool former paper that like, Meta had published back then? Would love to hear some thoughts and like, if you can enlighten us on this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the two aspects to it is actually let's dwell a little bit on how awesome plugins actually are, because I think that I had this kind of mind blown moment where I had to sort of read the plugins documentation like 2, 3 times to make sure that I understood what they were trying to tell me. Because I had this moment where I'm like, oh, it's not about instructing the model. It's not about writing code actually. It's how can I write this one pager in
Right.
English that literally instructs GPT about your
Exactly.
API.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, wait, is that really what it is? And so it took me a while to really grasp. And I was like, oh yeah. And now it's like, oh, of course. Why I use ChatGPT all the time to write code. So why wouldn't it be good at reasoning about generating an API call for given a description of your API? So it turns out that, man, it's just like my English communication skills turned out to be so way more important than my coding skills. It's like, oh shit, I wish I had done like a I don't know, liberal arts degree or something. It's like um, because that's what it is. That's how the plugins work, right? Like you're writing the schema and the specification for your API, particularly the English language parts of it, not the JSON parts of it, are the more important part because you're literally instructing ChatGPT on when to trigger your plugin and how to trigger your plugin. Which is just a mind blowing moment for me. It's like, oh wow, this is crazy, and that led me to looking at tool formers and some of the other stuff. Turns out people have been looking at this problem for a while. In terms of the quality, it's going back to what you and I experienced, right? I think it's very challenging to compete, at least as of today, whatever the date is, right? May 9th. I think OpenAI is pretty far ahead, pretty far ahead. I think that's because the LLM
Right.
itself is so good, right? I don't think there's anything specific about the API
Hmm.
part or the generation of the API that's special. I think it comes down to the quality of your model, and in particular, how good your model is at coding. And one of the interesting things for me has been, just comparing Bard with ChatGPT, how much better ChatGPT is at code related
Hmm.
tasks compared to Bard. And so if you have an LLM that's very good for code related tasks, it will be very good at this
Makes
plugin
sense.
dispatch and use, right? That's my guess. I don't actually know what's going on behind the scenes, but it appears that way. And so there is a quality gap. But again, going back to our earlier discussion, let's give it some time. I think the
We'll
open source
catch up.
stuff will catch up. There's no doubt. And you can see actually, by the way, the OpenAI guys are also catching on to this because Sam Altman's recent interview with Lex Friedman, he's like, yeah, we're not training GPT-5, right? GPT-4 is it. I don't think that the parameter race counts anymore. It's not about adding more gigahertz slash number of parameters, whatever, right? It's really going to be other ways in which you start to distinguish. So they're clearly looking at multimodal and things like that. So that's actually very encouraging for the open source models because there will be a point where you catch up to where GPT 3.5 and 4 are today, and then the hope would be that a lot of this plugin stuff will follow as well.
Makes sense.
Um,
And
um,
like talking about this English, like well, English being the new programming language in some way, right?
yes, yeah, absolutely,
So
yeah,
like how you mentioned about like you're basically giving instruction to the OpenAI models on when to trigger the plugins and stuff, right? Um, Now
yes.
I also remember from their documentation that they specifically tell you not to kind of micromanage your plugins in some way.
Yeah, don't
Exactly tell.
exactly. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. Yeah, I should probably correct it. I think the way that it's written is you should instruct how to use your plugin more than when, and then it will determine when based on. But the reason I said when is that you're indirectly
Right.
instructing it when, right? Because the way that you describe how to trigger your plugin is the only information it has to go on to in order to decide when to trigger your plugin, and that's where you hit into some of the limitations of the current thing where you can only have 3 plugins enabled at once, and it does make mistakes. It's not perfect, but look, I've been in the assistant space a long time, and these were really the two big problems to solve. Is like it was very bad user experience to like you look at Alexa and stuff right now, and you're like, Alexa, ask X to do Y. It's very like explicit, which never felt good. And LLMs have solved that part of the problem, but it's really the recovery flow that's even bigger deal. The reason it feels good with an LLM is not because it didn't get it right the first time, and it certainly 20% of the time it doesn't get it right. Like it doesn't trigger my plugin even though I very clearly asked something related to Hacker News. But I don't feel bad with my Alexa. I'm just angry and I want to throw my Alexa. It's like, oh, you stupid computer, right? But with ChatGPT, I'm like, oh, it's fine. It didn't understand. You know why? Because I am so confident that if I follow up and instruct it explicitly, it will
Right.
listen to me because it's so good at
Yeah.
understanding you. And just that follow up, the power of just, hey, you made a mistake. No, I actually asked the Hacker News plugin to do X, and I know with 100% confidence that it will listen to my instruction. That's the real power of LLMs. Like it's so good. And the way that it does it is so cute, right? It's like, oh, I
Yeah.
apologize
Yeah. Yeah.
for the confusion. I'm so sorry, and it's gonna do it. I was like, hey, no need to apologize. It's fine. You didn't get it right the first time. At least you're listening to me now. And you really could not do
For
this
sure.
with old school
100%.
assistants at all, right? Like even with all the multi-turn dialogue and this and that, the level of recovery that you have with LLMs is just so phenomenal that it doesn't even feel bad when it's wrong. And so I think you can get away with a lot with plugins with this kind of an architecture.
Nice. Awesome. So like turning gears towards, I think I know that you mentioned that you also did a project with Laura. I'd love to hear
Yeah,
a little bit more detail about like all these avatars that you were generating and what maybe even explain to our listeners what is the technical difference in like using a low rank approximation versus just like
yeah,
yeah.
versus like a full-on Dream Boot type stuff. Yeah, this is very interesting because actually it turns out LoRa was a technique from a paper from the folks at Microsoft actually a while ago. Turns out it was actually for fine-tuning large language models, but then it didn't get a lot of attention for whatever reason. And back then there was really not all this hype around AI. Um, but then for whatever reason, the LoRa used application for stable diffusion just shot that thing up into popularity. And I'll come back to the use of LoRa for large language models, but my specific project was, yeah, like anybody on Reddit, even just non-technical folks who are following Stable Diffusion, all were on this like LoRa bandwagon, right? And the reason for that is very simple. LoRa is just so much more accessible to the average person than Dreambooth is. And a few reasons for that is Dreambooth is very much a classic fine tune where you're taking an existing model, you're tweaking the weights of the model to learn some new class or subject or style, and then you output an entirely full new model. Whereas the LoRa adds, with my very primitive understanding of neural networks, just like a few layers at the very end that don't change the weights of the pre-trained model, as you want to call it, or the base model that you built it on, but it just kind of does some few layers at the end to kind of tweak stuff. And the actual LoRa file is very small because it's just those last few layers, and so it's 100 megabytes or so. It's like, and you can then attach multiple LoRa layers at the very end of your diffusion model, and so this is very powerful. Why? Because, well, it's much cheaper to generate a LoRa. Actually, I was so fascinated by how, again, non-technical folks who have no understanding of machine learning or even just programming are just able to take a Python notebook that you can run for free on a Google Colab. Like Google Colab is just completely blown up, right? It's like, actually, I'm curious to know how much money they're spending on that thing because it's free and everyone's just using it for all kinds of stuff. And you can just run this like Python notebook in Colab with no understanding of what, like all you're doing is like, oh, like here's my images of me and I'm just throwing it into this thing and I click these few buttons in Colab and really no understanding of what the code does. And boom, like you get this output as a 100 megabyte LoRa file. You take that LoRa file, you put it in your Stable Diffusion UI, whatever you're using, and just start generating images of yourself with prompts. It's like, how cool is that? This is so cool. And it really kind of landed for me that the speed of iteration, the accessibility of these fine-tuning techniques is so crucial to the success of it. Even if it, from a technical standpoint, it is inferior to an actual fine-tuning, because the number of times that people are going to use it and play with it and find new interesting ways to hack it are just completely going to outsize any gains you might get from the technical purity of your of your thing, right? So that's why LoRa is really catching on, and I think I'm very interested to see how LoRa would do in text situations, which what the original paper was all about, and now it's coming more into play because of Stable LM and Llama and some of these other stuff, like where people are trying to apply LoRa to text models as well. But it's way ahead on the image stuff, just because that came first in terms of people actually using it and playing with it. So I'm pretty convinced. I think the future for fine tuning is more LoRa, less Dreambooth. Don't fine tune the whole model. Just try to figure out how to attach some layers at the very end that tweak, and then should be cheap to generate, cheap to infer on, and that's really what's going to open the innovation floodgates. Because you should see some of the stuff that people are doing, this absolute unleashing creativity, like on a whole another level that I've never seen before. And it wouldn't be possible if it were very expensive to fine tune with a more classical technique. So I think just always optimize to increase your audience size and get this in the hands of as many people as possible. Because the other thing with LoRa, like you could run it on even old school GPUs, like people run it on a 1080 Ti or a 2080 Super. You don't even need a 4090 to do this stuff, right? It's like you need some graphics card. But even if it's very old, you can churn out a LoRa model, but you couldn't do that with Dreambooth.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Anand, for going into the details around that. This There's a couple more things that I wanted to discuss with you today. Number one, which is like, you ran a bunch of these experiments personally, right? And of course, like machine learning overall as a discipline has evolved quite a bit with respect to its tooling, right? Like a lot of MLOps tooling.
Yes.
But also there's like this
Yeah.
new trend around LLM ops, as they call it, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
realistically, it's just like, a set of tools that developers who are working with LLMs are going to need at some point, right? What were some of the tools that you personally found were lacking? What were some of the tools that you ended up using that you would recommend for people? Would love to hear some thoughts around that.
Yeah, it's a really great question. Oh man, I really wish I had done things differently, but that's okay. I think that's part of my learning process, is doing this and then learning about what I could have done differently. I was very naive in the beginning. I wasn't a good scientist. I wasn't recording my experiments at all, right? Because I was like, oh, I'll figure it out as it goes. But it was a big mistake, because let's just talk about this LoRa fine-tuning project. There are so many hyperparameters that you can tweak in this to get good outputs. And I was getting very lost in this. And there was a point, almost because I hadn't documented or had like a training diary or something a little bit more formal to track my experiments, because I was just
Right.
changing values in a Python file, a YAML file, JSON file, just trying this, testing the output, trying this, testing the output, without actually like having a notebook where I could say, okay, this was the result of this experiment, this was the result of this experiment. That actually halfway through the project, I almost gave up because it's a lot of fiddly bits, right? It's like there's 20 hyperparameters to choose from. Each has a range of values of from 1 to 100, whatever. It's like so many permutations and combinations that you can do, like going from like choice of your optimizer to there's Atom W8-bit, there's the new fangled D adaptation, and then there's an even newer ADA factor optimizer. And each of these have, how many epochs are you going to run? And this, there's just so many things. What's your learning rate, right? Like, oh, different learning rate for your text captions versus different learning rate for your UNet, which is more about the visual signal on your image. Just to give an example of a few hyperparameters. But yeah, man, I really wish that I had a good training diary, but not like a notepad. I mean, notepad can work, but like something actually like baked into
Right.
the training process, which doesn't exist. It's not there for any of the LoRa stuff that I tried out. At least it's not easily Googleable. Like I couldn't find anything. Much later on, someone pointed me to this
Right.
weightsandbiases.com. There's a new startup. It's like, oh, you should use weights and biases. I was like, oh man, I wish I had. Like now it's on my list of things to go look at first. So I would definitely recommend either doing a old school just training diary where you just open up a notepad, Notion, whatever, and just keep track of your experiments, or just use something more
Sure.
formalized like weights and biases. But that's all coming much later for me. Um, Other than that, I think. I just think as a community, we need to start documenting this stuff a lot more. It was very challenging for me to find information on what even these hyperparameters did. And I think with the number of like, and I still don't know if I got it right, by the way. So I put out this blog post and I made an open call for people to correct me if I'm wrong. But this is my best understanding of what impact this hyperparameter actually has on the output. Uh, and yeah, it's just challenging because I think the folks that actually build these models and techniques are so in it, they're so deep in the jargon, and they'll use terms X, Y, and Z. And to an outsider like me, it's like, no, it's all alien language, right? I don't understand what what this means. I can only observe. I can change a value and see the output and make my own conclusion about how this impacted the ultimate output. But if we're really serious about making this open source revolution, I think we need a lot better accessible documentation to actually like let people know how to use the stuff and what they all mean and what the different hyperparameters are and things like that. So I think we could really level up on that because that's already happened in the system space, right? If you look at something like we have a robust Linux open source community, Mozilla and Docker, and even for a newcomer to come in, it's it's a relatively easy learning curve, but it's not that way for ML right now. And
Makes
so,
sense.
uh, but it's getting there. Yeah, I think there's a lot of people looking
I
at the
am. I'm
problem.
confident that one of the developers who is listening to this podcast will basically just go ahead and build an open source repository with all this detailed explanations of all the hyperparameters out there.
That would be awesome. I would
Yeah.
love that. That would be so good. Yes.
Awesome. Cool. I think this is super helpful. Maybe like one other thing that people always love to hear about is how are you staying up to date with all these new developments that are happening? Are you following certain podcasts, certain blog series, or Twitter? What's your main source of information? Yeah.
Yeah. It can be pretty overwhelming, right? Look, I mean, whether we like it or not, Twitter is where it's happening. I think I couldn't live without Twitter, at least as far as knowledge for AI is concerned. For whatever reason, the community has snapped onto AI, onto Twitter as like the way to get cutting edge news onto Twitter. And it's actually incredible, like how quickly I'm able to find out about something that's happening on Twitter. It's just a great way to stay up to date. It hasn't really happened in Mastodon or any other kind of social network. I think Blue Sky is emerging right now, but still invite only, not that many people there. So look, whether you like it or not, I think Twitter is where it's at least as far as staying AI. There's lots of good podcasts. I really enjoy Ben Thompson's Stratechery. It's a more general industry podcast about just he's an analyst and he just talks about everything. And obviously, as most tech podcasts, they have significant coverage of AI as things are rolling out. That's very good. The Dithering is very good, which is also by Ben Thompson, but then it's a partnership with John Gruber, who's like a longtime Apple blogger. He has great things to say. Author of Daring Fireball. That stuff is pretty good. Um, And then just going to events, man. Actually, the funny thing has been the offline world has been really great for me
Nice.
recently. Maybe we're all coming down from the COVID isolation, but like you're in the Bay Area, I'm in the Bay Area, and it's just popping right now where it's like there's events going on. There's a very nice website, cerebralvalley.ai, I think is the name, where they are keeping a nice log of all the events going on. And so actually, I learned so much from just going to hackathons and talking to people and just in meet space, meeting people and exchanging ideas and asking them about their experiences and stuff. I really miss that. I think we all didn't get much of
The
that
last couple of
because of the
years, yeah.
COVID stuff, but just meeting people in person, like surprisingly, it's like low tech way to get latest
Yeah.
news, right? Like just go to events, which hopefully there are events happening all over the country, but in Bay Area in particular, it shouldn't be hard to find something interesting to go to.
Amazing, awesome. Thanks a lot, Anant, for taking the time and walking us through some of your amazing experiences building on top of Gen AI, and of course sharing these wonderful experiments that you have been running on. To our listeners, there is one thing that I specifically want people to understand, that we're talking to an engineering director at Meta who has the excitement and I think the low level understanding of so it's a very rare combination that I think people would find. Thanks a lot, Anand, for doing this with us. Like, this was super helpful. Yeah,
Very kind words. Thank you, Nikunj. And you just had fantastic questions, man. You're great. What a fantastic, great interviewer. I had a blast. I love talking about this stuff. I hope that everyone's as excited about this as we are. We really are in a special moment. I think I'm not underplaying it. Like, I know there's a lot of hype. There always is with any such cycle, but what's happening right now is actually incredible. And everyone's kind of waking up, and it's very exciting to see all this passion and energy around it, including folks like yourself and the stuff that you're working on in your company. Very timely. So all the best. Yeah, this was fun. Thanks for inviting me
great.
over.
Thank you so much, Anand.